All right, let's get started. So I'm going to talk about a few general things before you get right into the report. Let's start with Google Drive. So let's go here. So when you're organizing your Google Drive, make sure you have different folders for different things. And this could look like your financial documents, your pictures that you're going to take throughout your project, your reports and presentation, and then any of your design files need to go in one folder. The way we've decided to organize our reports and files was to follow this pattern. So basically the year, the month, and then the date. And this just allows you to see which files are most up to date. Make sure you set all of these reports before your semester begins. So for right now, you should be setting up your PDR and your CDR. And there's really good ways to set those up, and I'll go through it with you in a second. Um, the other thing I wanted to talk about is that when you're working on documents in Google Drive, make sure you're not deleting other people's work. Use comments and make sure you write your initials with it so that it can be traced back to you. And then what I recommend doing is doing a final sweep at the end of every report. And what you would do in the sweep is basically make sure your comments are in a different font color, and then you would go step by step throughout the whole report and make sure everything's perfect, and then do another sweep for formatting and then submit your report. All right, so let's get into the first report. I want to show you a little bit of the requirements review and what should be done over there and what's the best practice. So we'll go over here. So this was our requirements review. Mhm. So basically, this is how we set it up. The identifier, so every requirement has its own category. When we put in our requirements, we were really specific about the requirements. So this one over here, it's about the logo. It tells you the size of the logo and like where it will be placed. So on both sides over here. Now this also shows where this requirement comes from. You might not have a specific location where the requirement comes from, so you can state any other source, or you can say that you created your own. Now, this is the most important part. Basically, what you need to do over here is you need to tell how you're going to test this requirement and when it will be tested and what shows that your requirement was passed or failed. So over here, we're going to measure it using a ruler, and then we're going to test it on Jan 1st, between Jan 1st and February 15th. I know some people have told me that they can't think of a specific time because it's so far down into the project. But what I would recommend is putting a date down and do that with everything, and you can change that later on. And so once you're done with all of that, we'll go over this part later on. Another thing I recommend doing is creating a summary of hours and document all the work that you've done in meeting minutes, and then make sure you have this so that you can track all the time that you're spending. So the way we did it was basically have all the meetings over here, and then so the name of the meetings, when the meetings were, what we talked about, and then how many hours, the duration of the meeting basically, and then we totaled that up. The other thing we did for this report is basically write down what each member did for that specific part and how many hours it took for them to get through that. And then we total up all the hours. And this is going to help you out a lot later on. Another thing we've done for this report is basically have the meeting minutes attached at the end of the report. And that basically just gives an overall good impression. Uh, Now I want to show you the critical design report. And uh, the reason why I'm showing you the critical design report is basically once you create a Google document, if it goes above like 40, 50 pages, it becomes impossible to edit with six people on the doc, changing stuff. It just becomes hell. So what I recommend doing is following a pattern similar to this, where you have different files created in Google Doc and then linked to the original document. So basically over here, this is a link to the external document. And then if you make any changes to it in the future, all you have to do is paste the link and then explain what the changes are. There's a couple things that this does is basically when somebody's reading your report, if they want to skip a part, so for example over here, somebody does not need to read all the team member statements. They can choose to do so, but they can also skip over this part in a really fast, so it wouldn't take them a lot of time. They don't have to scroll through a bunch of things, and it really helps you too, because then you all you need to do is update those documents, and moving forward, it saves you a lot of time in formatting, copy pasting, and all that different things. And then when somebody's looking for what you've done, all the changes you've made, they can read through this part over here, explanation of changes, and basically they can go in and they know exactly what to look for instead of trying to figure out what's been changed since last time, and it really helps. So I would recommend doing that. Unfortunately, we did not do that for our PDR, so it's going to be a little bit uh, laggy in some parts. So let's start with the report. Table of contents, that's simple stuff. Table of figures, table of tables, and that just helps you look more professional and helps people find things more a bit faster. So the first thing that comes up is a statement of project objectives. This is really simple. You just need to create an objective tree diagram. This is the one we've created over here. I'll pause here so you can look at this tree. It'll be different for you. Make sure you create your own. This is just an example of what it would look like. You can also search online to see what objective tree diagrams look like. Moving on. So you're possibly changing some of your requirements for this report, and you're possibly updating them based on the feedback you got. What I would recommend is creating a legend. So the way we've done it over here is if there's any text, any changes being made to a requirement, we've highlighted it in red. If there's any text being added, we've done so in a red font, and that just helps somebody read faster what the changes are. And if there's any new requirements, they're highlighted in green. And if there's any text removed, we just strike through the text so that it's obvious what's going on. So you can see there were some changes that were being made to our requirements, and you can do that for your requirements. This is going to be specific to your project, so we're just going to scroll through it. Oh, another thing I want to mention is that if you add new requirements, please add an explanation showing where these requirements are coming from, and that will really help you out. So the next thing on the list is a preliminary design concept. You're supposed to make a functional structure diagram, and this is what our functional structure diagram looks like. So FSD, you have inputs, outputs, and then a black box diagram to start with, and then it has 5 steps. So step number 2 is basically taking all the inputs and then tracing them out to the outputs. So we have our first flow, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And basically you assemble all the different flows to show how they interact with each other. And then finally, you would create a bounding box to show what functions lie within your project scope and what's outside. Once you've done that, every function in the functional structure diagram will have different options that you can do to satisfy that function. You would use a morphological chart. So our morphological chart wasn't that great. I've seen better morphological charts. So spend some time on it. Make sure it's amazing. And then when you're making different designs, one thing to note is when we created our own morphological chart, we knew what we wanted to create, and we just threw in a couple of other options that we didn't want to pursue. So if you do it that way, it's super obvious. What I would recommend doing is make sure all the options in the morphological chart is viable, and based on what your priority is, like if you prioritize safety more, you would pick one design over the other, and you want to be a bit more transparent in that way. If you're just picking options that are not viable, it'll be obvious right away. So try to avoid that. So just a picture showing what the design looks like. There we go. Oh, so for the rating, we provided a rating scale, And then all our criterias go on the left side. We assigned a weight to each criteria, and then we scored each design. And what I do recommend is adding an explanation for scores. That's really important because somebody will not understand why you rated something higher in one category or criteria than the other. So this will really help. So for all three designs, make sure you have an explanation of scores attached at the end. And then finally, you want to add like system use cases and operation concepts, which is basically how each specific design would be used, what are the situations uh, that each design is good for. Moving on. So, so all those items in the morphological chart, those are your key functions. This over here is a trade study and technological readiness review. And this basically talks about if the technology is ready or not, if you need further testing to make sure the technology is ready, and where it's being used right now. So in the trade itself. So this shows like the past winners, they've used this component in their design and talks about all these different things. It will be different for you, but trade study is basically how these components are being used in the real life right now. And all these bullet points come from your morphological chart. For technical design budgets, I'm sure everybody's designing something. Three major things that you need to focus is a mass budget, size budget, and then an energy budget. And then if there are specific things related to your project, you would add them over here. It's really hard to figure out what exactly these are going to be. So these are just going to be estimates. So put a number down. For us, we said around 44, 45 pounds for the mass budget. What was for their total vehicle, and then we said 17 pounds for our fairing. So that was our mass budget, and then we had a drag coefficient and a size budget. And these just came from the ASME report. Spend some time figuring out what it would look like. Make sure it's an overestimation, and then you can refine it later on. So early simulations and test result. Basically, what you need to talk about over here is if you can put some kind of testing that's been done outside that proves that you're headed in the right direction. So for us, we showed that. Sorry about that. So for us, we showed that there are different aerodynamic shapes, and what we're pursuing is going to be the most aerodynamic, and then we're going to build on top of that. Moving on. All right, so the next part is manufacturability and universal design. So there's, I believe, 12 guidelines for design for manufacturing. And what we did over here is we just listed them all, and then we talked about how we can incorporate them in our own design. What I would recommend to you is doing the same, list them all out, and try to figure out how you would apply to your design. And they're really generic guidelines like avoid left and right hand parts, design with symmetry, design for fixturing, and stuff like that. And it's really uh, not that complicated, and you just need a small paragraph explaining how it applies to your design. Moving on, there's principles for universal design. Same idea over here. List all the principles out and then try to think about how they apply to your design. Here's some example of how we've explained it. All you need is a small paragraph explaining how it applies to your project. So trade study identification. This is a really important part. What they want over here is that whatever design that you've chosen, you do a trade study and see how many other people are using it and if it's beneficial for them or not. So the way we conducted our study was we chose the past three winners, and then for each component or each function, we looked at what each of the winners were using. So 2016, 2017, 2018, all the winners, we went through the reports and figured out what they were doing for each specific function. And it talks about why we chose what we chose, and that's what you need to do in trade study. And this would all depend on your functions. Moving on, this is just general stuff. It'll be really specific to your project. Now, financial and management volume. This is like a really good part. Uh, so the first thing in here is the work breakdown structure. The way we've divided is we weren't really sure. There's a lot of work that needs to be done and it overlaps. So we created a journal diagram which outlines a design process, which is design, prototype, build, and test. And then we wrote down what would happen each specific part. Now we realized there's a lot of overlap in here, so what we did is we created packages to outline how they were interlinked. So right here. So the way we analyze our work packages is by created a main package which would run through the major deliverable by Capstone, and then we created a sub package where we need to do all the things that were required for the next work package. So they're called alpha, sub alpha, bravo, sub bravo, and they have the same timeline. We also calculated how many days we have for each package, and then how many of them are available. So this is minus any of the holidays and other things, and then we approximated how many hours we had available during that time. And these are estimates. You just need to put a number down that's logical, and then you can change that later on, which is why we have an asterisk at the end of it. So moving on for work packages, this is what a work package looks like. So it has duration, how many hours, what the ID is. So have some fun over here, create your own numeric scheme. What we did is we assigned 2 managers to a work package, and then 4 support people, and then we listed out all the inputs required for that work package, and then the tasks that need to be performed, and then the outputs. And then you can go on and create as many work packages. They just need to be linked to each other by duration or by sequence. So we'll skip through that. There you go. This is why I recommend creating a separate document so you don't have to scroll through a bunch of stuff just to move on to the next item. For resource allocation, this is what one of the tables look like. So you have names of the members over here, and then you have all the different work packages, and then hours spent on that specific work package by person. And then here's the hours divided by month. Now these are all estimate numbers. You don't have to be really specific, just put a number down and you can change that later on depending on how much you work on it. So the next item is the project schedule. So for the project schedule, here's where you need to involve some kind of software to analyze or represent your project. So I've seen a couple people use Project BI, which is a really interesting software. If you have some past experience with it, I would recommend using it. But if you don't, it takes a lot of effort to learn, and I would avoid it completely because it would not be worth your effort. What we did for our project is we went through all these different softwares, and then we found out which ones were free, which ones gave us the ability to use it in different ways. So the one we decided to go with was Team Gantt, and I'll show you here. I already have it open over here. So this is what it looks like. So we have all our milestones up here. This is the date, and then we had all our work packages over here, and it shows what item needs to be completed in that work package, and then who's assigned to that task. So, and how they're interlinked. So we created that all the way through the project. And this was like exam period. There we go. So that's like they're interlinked. It just shows. Another thing we did is we listed all our meetings and any scheduled holidays over here in the Gantt chart. And it just gives you a really good overview. And I would recommend using this, but also go out and look for the options that might be better for you. So going back, we were over here. Awesome. Project equipment and procurement and equipment / travel list. It's basically all the costs associated with your project and how much money you're going to spend on it. Uh, the more detailed you can be with it, the better it is. For us, we were really unsure at the start, and this is what we came up with. But as you progress throughout the project, you will have a more detailed equipment list once you figure out what items you need to buy and all these other things. So the next item is a risk register. The way we set up was likelihood of a risk, and then the consequence. So minor, moderate, major, critical. And then based on what it was, we rated it as low, medium, high, or extreme. And then for each block, we wrote down all the different parts that could happen and like all the problems that you would face. And then moving on, we wrote down how we will mitigate every single thing. So if we run into a problem, how are we going to work around it, and how are we going to minimize it? And then we gave a whole description of everything that was going on. And lastly, I want to talk about self-evaluation. Uh, you want to make sure you write meeting or exceeding in that part. You want to make sure you mention a couple of things in justification. So you want to write down what you did. You want to show where you did it, so make sure you write page numbers, specific references to the page. And lastly, you want to justify why it's exceeding. So once you've done what you've done and where it is, it'll be really easy to justify. And make sure you're always writing meeting or exceeding, because if you're writing anything below that, you're giving uh, them the opportunity to mark you lower. And you guys work hard on this, and I want you to get the best grade possible. And your references, and lastly, so this is the requirements over here. That's pretty much it for PDR. I wish you best of luck, and let me know if you have any questions.